Welcome to the Last American Vagabond. Joining me today in studio for what? I think the third, no, I guess second, not counting Pirate Stream, second person in live in the News TLAV studio. Joining me, Derrick Broze, here to talk about any number of things. We're both going to be attending the Bitcoin conference coming up, well, I guess starting today over the next so many days. And we just wanted to connect in person. You know, we're here, we're real, we're together, and you know, talk about his recent work and just see what else we get into. So how are you, brother? What's going on?
Great, man. Just happy to be here and glad to connect again in person.
Yeah, you're right. We actually connected what I want to say conference, the rally, I guess we put together in Franklin. Yeah,
that was a good event. Of COVID 1984.
That's right. Bucking the system, marching down the street. And that was, I like that. Actually, that was fun. What I liked about that, actually, since we bring it up, was the overlap of, like, as much as there is obviously a lot of overlap in our audiences, like having, like, you know, supporters that are there to support TLAV and supporters there for conscious resistance, and kind of having them together and see that unification. And, you know, that was a fun event, man. I like that.
That was a good time.
For us. And we both performed music there, right?
That was, that was another good part of it. Happy to be back here, man. It's beautiful out here.
Yeah. Oh man. That's the one thing about being here in Tennessee. It's just something, I mean, coming from, you know, especially living in California, the place is not even politically, just the climate, just something really special about this place, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I love it.
Well, so let's get into any number of things we're going to talk about today. And we were talking about the Summit of the Future. I think we want to start with, right? And what that is, and, you know, why that's important. So for those that haven't read your work on that, I think 2 now discussing it, let people know what that is, and we'll get into it.
Sure. Yeah. So actually, I was looking back at all of my articles for TLAV. So for those who don't know, we started writing together, collaborating in May 2020. And I started writing about the Summit of the Future in 2022. Just 1 or 2 mentions, not really going into depth as I have recently. But those were just sort of previewing of they're discussing something in the future called the Summit of the Future. And there's a whole history that goes back to 2020, 2022. Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, has been saying we're falling short of the Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 Agenda, and we need to come up with new financial mechanisms to fund this green revolution, this transition towards all the different things they want to do under the SDG model. And so that has just gone on and on, from white paper to online event, leading to last year's Sustainable Development Summit, and then that led to this year's Summit of the Future. And in one way, it's just a continuation of these ongoing globalist, internationalist meetings where they get together, and really technocratic, where they get together and they start talking about which way they think the world should go and how to address these crises that many of us might argue aren't necessarily even crises themselves, what they claim, right? But nevertheless, so they're gathering together, and this year it's going to be called the Summit of the Future. It's happening during the UN's annual General Assembly, so like a week-long meeting of UN officials getting together and discussing all kinds of things, mainly climate change, obviously, is going to be big topic of the whole thing. But for these first couple of days, or these 2 days, I think it's the 22nd and the 23rd in New York City, they're hosting the Summit of the Future. And typically I would say, okay, it's just another UN meeting, maybe not anything of major importance, but the hype around this thing, particularly in UN circles, it really, as I write in my latest article, it hasn't really broken out to like the mainstream so much. There's some in the independent media, mainly myself and a couple others, talking about this. And warning that we think it's going to be something major, because they're talking about signing the Pact for the Future. And then as part of that, they're talking about declaring a planetary emergency. And each of these things have implications, just like the big, you know, concern and recent awareness of the World Health Organization Pandemic Treaty, Pandemic Alliance, Pandemic Agreement, where so many people have been concerned with that over the last year and a half or so, rightfully so. Well, this is equally important, I think, for us to get some awareness around. And so I've been trying to write these articles, but mainly, as you mentioned, the last couple months, I've been writing more and more about it. And this latest piece is kind of why you should give a crap about this, because it is starting to pop up in more areas outside of just the, you know, UN academic circles, which, they're having their meetings, they're having their online discussions. And they really are planning on getting all of the member states to sign this new document. They're talking about creating UN 2.0, redesigning the multilateral system. And this, I think the most worrisome aspect is this planetary emergency. And this calls for creating an emergency platform. And we can get into all that.
Yeah, well, I mean, so first, what's the Pact of the so we have the Summit of the Future and then the Pact of the Future. So just what's the difference there for people that don't know?
So the summit is the actual event that they're going to be gathering. That's what they're calling their, you know, like they're gathering, which they're saying is a once in a lifetime, similar to that Great Reset language. You know, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity for us to remake and redo the UN system, because we need to give it, in their own words, as I quote in my article, that some of these UN officials and advocates for this Pact for the Future are, we need to give the UN more power. We need to give the UN more power to address and they're mimicking the WF language, the poly crisis.
Right.
This sort of idea that we're facing, which I think is true on some level, like a lot of things, you know, we've talked about this before. They point out actual problems in some areas. Now, some we would definitely debate on who's the source of the problems, but they point out actual problems. It's just that their solutions are this top-down technocratic, force it on people, how much you can drive, how much you can eat, what goes on your plate, how often you can wash your clothes, stuff like, we've seen the plans and the discussions of the future. And so that's the problem, is it's this top-down. It's not about how we could address maybe some real crises and do it in a way that does still respect people's freedom of choice and, you know, all bodily autonomy and all that stuff.
What's really interesting about what you just pointed out is that we always see this, right? We see essentially, like we've been just pointing about the word sustainable and all these different games they've played where you frame something, in many cases is a genuine issue. And then you get this weird partisan dynamic where rightly so, they're sensing some dishonesty there. So they push back on it, but instead of trying to find the other possible solutions, they act like it doesn't exist. Right. So clearly there is a problem with most of the things they're highlighting. They're just trying to direct you in a way that, you know, and whether, again, the problem was created by them or not, which in most cases it is, direct you in a way that benefits their agenda. And so instead of, you know, so there are people that try to find other solutions and they point to that, and then certain parts of the partisanship will act like you're then going in their direction, you know? And so it's just this constant dynamic, which again is a constant, one of the things that I'm looking forward to the conversation we're going to have about the way that the partisanship is used, as a lot of us point out, but as right now it seems more dangerous than ever as people kind of getting pulled back into it.
No, absolutely.
And like the UN aspect of this, the Great Reset and all these overlapping points, you know, right now what I'm seeing is the right side of it sort of being pulled in. Now you've got all of these sides driving the same thing. And so this points to the problem is, you know, the poly crisis and these different arguments are, you know, taking climate change, for example.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, I think there are clear examples of how we're destroying this planet, largely the people that are pretending that we are doing it. Yeah. But, you know, driving you in a way that makes nothing happen or only what they want, right? Which the Greater Reset is a good example of actual choices we could make, right? That would solve those problems. So in the regard to the Pact of the Future, so this is the agreement. This is what they're writing down, what we're going to do going forward.
Exactly. They're trying to get all 192, 93 member states of the United Nations to sign on this document, which, as I've written in my previous article and I mentioned in this new one, that they've already released the zero draft version of this. They did so, I think, in March or April. And so I've read through that, and I've quoted a few different places where they talk of like an international environmental court that could not only go after corporations, but individuals in some cases. Now there's, you know, it's all just draft version right now. So none of that's in the final version, but it's showing where they're thinking and what they're talking about. And it does mention this emergency platform. So this is one of the things that I'm concerned about. So again, the Summit of the Future is the meeting that's going to happen the 22nd, 23rd, New York City. The agreement that they are discussing, and likely, it seems all but likely at this point, they're going to sign it, some version of it, in New York City, called the Pact for the Future, which is like dozens to 100+ pages, depending on the final version of it. And it discusses things like I mentioned, a criminal court for environment. It also mentions the creation of an emergency platform that could be initiated in the case of a crisis. And I have the language. It's something like something that rises to impact multiple regions of the world, something very kind of vague that could be easily exploited and taken to, you know, any, you could name any number of things that you could say, okay, well, this is affecting multiple regions, so let's initiate that emergency.
Seems like damn near everything happening this day frame
exactly,
that way, right?
And especially because what they're discussing as crises, they definitely mention climate change, they mention war, famine, pandemics, of course, and economic turmoil, things like that, that could be classified as an emergency, and then these emergency platforms could be brought about. And again, a lot of the discussion, particularly around, I mentioned Jeffrey Sachs. Now, I don't know if did you ever interview him, or do you know?
No, but it's an interesting overlap because he makes a lot of great points about U.S. foreign policy.
That's how I had heard about him. So for those who don't know, he was the chair of the Lancet, the medical journals, COVID-19 Commission, and he was talking about gain and function research. He was talking about potential lab leak theory, and I remember seeing his name out there because he did seem to be making some points. And it's like, oh, okay, look at this guy. He's in this position. He's saying some good things. And as I mentioned in the article, he was also on like Jimmy Dore, Russell Brand, other places. Well, he wrote this new op-ed that's on his website, his blog or whatever, pretty much just all in on advocating for the summit of the future and for the Pact for the future, and saying that it's necessary. And as I mentioned in the article, he in addition to being, with the Lancet in that position, he's worked for the UN in a number of different ways, number of different positions, advising the current UN Secretary General and the previous Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. And he comes from Columbia University, which is the university origin of the technocracy movement back to the 1930s. So that's just like another interesting connection, because what they're advocating here for is, just like with the Great Reset, is a technocratic kind of ideal of micromanaging society based on crises that they're claiming are happening, and that they're going to come together, and all these nation states that allegedly are representing us. I mean, most people have no idea what's even going on,
right,
but they're allegedly representing us and going to sign some new document that will give us UN 2.0 and sign this Pact for the future, potentially giving them these powers they're giving themselves to declare an emergency at some point. And the main call is what they're calling a planetary emergency. And that does relate particularly to climate change. They talk about water, sustainability, water issues, and deforestation, different things, again, sometimes pointing at real problems, but misdirecting. I think you touched on it earlier, and it is, I think, accurate in most cases, unfortunately, that the same people creating the problems are then presenting these solutions or alleged solutions that they want us to go towards, when they're the people who created the problem in the first place.
Well, so talking about Jeffrey Sachs in general, and this is an interesting overlap, right? Is that so clearly, I mean, it's hard. It could very well be that this is a person that's out there presenting other good ideas in the interest of kind of tricking you into this other direction, which is always something we should ask. But what do you think about that? Because it's interesting. I could see people with good intentions falling into this and thinking that this is what we like, especially right now with what we're watching in regard to the way the U.S. government is operating unilaterally, and Israel, and so now you got this push from people who might, and I'm not saying I think this, I'm just putting it as an objective possibility, coming out and thinking that the more globalist direction would be the way to stop something like that. Maybe that's exactly why that's happening, right? And so you got these people that would step into this. Like, my point is, so he'll come out, and as I think we've talked about, and he's made some amazingly clear points about belligerent U.S. foreign policy, what they actually have been doing, what they're doing today, what he knows, what they're like, and they're lying about Israel, they're lying about Syria, it's, and that's why, like, Jimmy Dore has talked to him, it's hard, you see that, you go, yes. And the point should be either way, that's the right thing to point out, even if he's doing it for different reasons. But so then the question is, what do you think the likelihood is that this is something he really thinks might be solving one of these problems, but he's being fooled into it like many other people, like maybe just a broad sense too? How often do you think it's happening?
I don't want to claim to, know his inner motivations or anything like that, but I think all those possibilities you mentioned are possibilities. Like, for sure, there are a lot of brilliant people who, can be really brilliant and have a great analysis in some areas or multiple areas or maybe a single area, and be really off base in a completely other. So that's possible that all, as humans, we all have blind spots and maybe aren't as well researched in some areas we'd like to be, but have strong opinions and things like that. So that's always a possibility, because I think sometimes we might jump to, or some people online might jump to conspiracy really right away, if this person must be this or that. And I wasn't intending necessarily to imply that in the article, just quoting like, hey, this is what he's calling for, though. Like, again, he said these things about COVID and other areas, but he definitely is advocating for the system. And it would be something good for somebody who interviews him, maybe I'll get to interview him at some point, to ask him like, hey, you're really great in this particular topics, but what do you think about this view of the things you're advocating for the UN? I quoted him in the article. He says, quote, "On the goal of reforming the UN system, the key is to give more power to UN institutions and to make them more representative." That's the goal, right? And he's also calling for new financial instruments to fund like a new system of international taxes on CO2 emissions, shipping, aviation, financial transactions.
A point would be, for example, there are people that I believe have good intentions that are completely snowed by the idea of the climate change narrative, right? And so what me in saying all that, like if I had to bet, I would kind of think that might be what's happening there, right? So I'm not suggesting that either of us would know, or that but I think what's important to think about is it's almost like, and something that you always kind of really chop away at, the kind of the base problem is the reverence towards authority in general. Like we're supposed to, instead of solving these problems in a way that are individual, or, the whole point is a lot of these people end up feeling like there has to be a centralized solution. Otherwise it won't be possible.
I think so.
And so so this is, how do we defeat a problem like that? Where you have people that hypothetically are good intentioned and end up always seemingly falling into some level of centralized authority that needs to solve that problem. How do you get around that?
For me, so I think that's a great question. So I think part of it for me is why I consider myself a journalist in one particular area of my life, writing, reporting about things like this, but then also on the activist front, somebody who wants to organize something like the People's Reset, the Greater Reset, or go out and pass out flyers, or, do the activation tour we did during COVID. Because to me, it's like, that's how I'm going to reach people. I need to educate people and maybe consider people to get them to consider that maybe they can run their own lives and they don't need somebody telling them how to run their life, and just promoting, just literally planting that seed in people's minds. So I kind of consider it really being, at least for me, a two-part kind of battle here. One part is education, waking people up, reporting facts, getting people to consider ideas and things of that. And then also the sort of, I guess, activist push for planting the seed of liberty and, people self-ownership and these sort of ideas in different ways, whether that, for me is personally doing speeches and writing books and that kind of thing. I feel like those are both important, right? Waking people up to the facts of the world, but then also, some people will then go from there to thinking, and I don't really get it at this point, if we truly understand the role of intelligence agencies, the mafia, the various false flags that are documented in so many different ways, and then thinking that this system is somehow going to let us win through voting. It just, for me personally, is kind of mind blowing. But of course that doesn't mean things are hopeless, but anyways.
No, I mean, I think that's important. It always comes back to that, doesn't it? It's just funny, and not that we were even planning to get into the conversation of voting, but it's it's this hurdle that we can't seem to get beyond. I honestly think at this point they came out and utterly, which frankly I think that's already happened, but utterly proven with documents and statements that it's your vote literally has no effect on the outcome. Actually, I think Represent.us did with that Princeton study, where they said it was statistically insignificant, zero out, but at the end of the day, even if that happened, people would still go, okay, well, even though I know it has no effect, I'm going to do it because what else are we going to do? That's the kind of response we always get. It's just this hurdle that we cannot ever get past. Same thing when it comes to local voting. There's, do what you think has the most effect. But, we need to battle this problem of thinking that at some level we have to appeal to the people telling us they're going to solve our problems. Otherwise it will never actually happen. And it's I think your work does a great job really showing people that there is another direction, opting out and taking different, there are other ways to go. And I think that's super important.
I want to preempt the comments that are incoming after you mentioned that, is that, some people will hear that and then take that to mean, oh, so you've just given up.
Exactly.
Because I've been hearing this a lot. I mean, this is one of the things we have an upcoming discussion with a great group of friends in a couple of weeks here, because of, and we don't have to get all into the whole thing, but because of post this assassination attempt, whatever it is, there's just even more statist hysteria on all fronts. And then with the recent drama of going on with Biden and Harris, just all of it's it's grabbing everybody's attention, sucking all the air out of the room, which I think is done on purpose during these times.
Right.
And, you could say it's to distract us from other stories. I mean, that does happen. And that's not always the case, but it does happen. But absolutely, it's meant to keep people's focus and trained. And I think that's both a sort of mental awareness, but also even on a spiritual front of keeping us just entrapped into that system. So I say all that to say, choosing not to participate in that system after knowing all the craziness is not choosing to give up. Maybe for some people there is an apathy, but that's not what I personally advocate at all. I mean, I like to say that I vote with my actions every day, and that is the sort of idea that many of us are familiar with, of voting with your dollar, right? Of the kind of corporations and businesses you support. Supporting local businesses over others, support people with values that you have, if you like to do those sort of things. That idea. but also a number of other ways where you're just choosing to not participate in different systems. So it doesn't mean that that you've checked out of society and you don't care and you're just, or people will say, oh, you're just want everything to crash. I've heard that a lot. And then what I'm saying is post-Trump assassination and this hysteria of me proposing that, hey, maybe you don't need to vote for any of these people. Maybe you don't need to settle for Trump based on what we've already seen and what we're hearing now of who he might work with, et cetera, et cetera. And for some people, their first thought was like, so you just don't care anymore. You're just giving up. But that's the opposite of, so I just wanted to make that clear because there will be people who jump straight to that. They think that just not voting is, and again, to me, this is part of the programming, thinking of that like that. We're in our beautiful minds and all the realities of human beings, everything that we can think of and dream up. The idea that if you don't vote, that's it. There's just nothing else. There's nothing else there to do. It's either we're going to be violent, we're going to go storm the Capitol, we're going to throw Molotov cocktails, we're going to, riot or whatever. That's how we're going to have our revolution, or we're going to vote our way out of this, or we're just going to be apathetic. And that's what we've kind of, most people, I think, considered the various options somewhere in that, shades of those things.
Yeah, well, it just highlights the same circle of problem. It comes back to the idea that it's, so the idea of what we're saying being framed as giving up simply means that the only, like you just said it, the only thing that would matter is the vote then.
Yeah.
Like, and this is what's so infuriating about it is that there's obviously, I think, a verifiable reality that the actions that have more effect in every possible way that we do every single day, and I think that most of the people that are in that position, there's plenty of people that are just like, I don't care, that exists.
Yeah.
But most people that are saying recognize voting has no effect are not then going, I give up. It's in fact much, much more around that. And I think that's self-evident, so that's people that are just like they do not want to acknowledge that they don't have that influence. And I think that just terrifies them. It's a little bit of cognitive dissonance.
I definitely think people are, it's like for some people, it feels like, because I'll hear this from people. Okay, yes, I hear you. Yes, the system is that corrupted. Yes, these things are going on, but I got to do something. And okay, this is one thing. If you feel like voting serves you in some way, go there, go get your sticker, press the button, do the thing that you got to do. And I hope your team wins. Hopefully it's good for everybody, right? Whatever the storyline is. But I truly mean that. And now I think it's worth way more of your time on the local level if you are a voting person to get involved. We've talked about this before. I ran for mayor a couple of times, not with really any intention that I was going to get in the office, but it opened up doors to get on the radio, get on local TV, talk about surveillance, talk about privacy, talk about the issues that I care about, and advance these things on the local level in the area that I live in. So if that's something you think is important, if you want to vote for somebody on the school board, then do those things. But also at the same time, or even if you are going to vote in the presidential election, do these different kinds of things. I mean, imagine if we're 90 days away from the election, maybe a little more than that. If you decided to start growing your own food today, or, just learning new skills, like there's so many other ways that you can, again, vote with your actions that in that time, again, plan to vote, go vote on election day. But between now and then, try these other things, explore options outside of big tech, like start thinking about getting off these different systems that we know are going to lead to the fourth industrial revolution, great reset, you will own nothing, be happy world that they're trying to create, and it's not that I don't think we can potentially delay that, prevent it, but in the case that we can't, if you're still on these old legacy systems, you're going to get pulled into that reality. So with the idea is then don't just vote and wait and trust that a politician's going to fix, especially in the case of Trump, where we can see who he's connected to.
Right.
Instead, okay, if you want to do that, but also put your energy into what you can actually do in your own community, in your own area. So, I mean, that's essentially the message. It's actually far from giving up, and it's actually a lot more work than just pressing a button and voting.
More responsibility.
Exactly.
And for those that are specifically looking for other than voting to make it a political change, then, do whatever, go out and protest, go and speak to your Congress people if you think that makes a difference. There's a lot of other things that, like, even objectively in regard to the vote itself, within the context of what you see, actually have more of a difference on the outcome, in my opinion, But so to bring this back to the point, so, to what we were talking about, that you were talking about the planetary emergency, right? And where this is, the idea of creating, identifying the poly crisis. And this obviously overlaps with the cyber polygon and the cyber pandemic and the same things they're pushing.
That could be the crisis.
Right. And so we're talking about the planetary emergency declaration, and to kind of overlap that with this point is what I see happening everywhere. Is that so? That obviously, I think, is more effective against the left. right?
Yeah.
The idea that we're dealing with the climate change problem and all the pandemics, and so we have to act, right? So you got a lot of the left, I think, that are almost like sleepwalking away, okay with a lot of that stuff.
Yeah.
And then on the right, this is where I see this push happening now to aggressively get them on board from the other side of it, right? For whether it's digital IDs or, whatever it is, but through the idea of like stopping illegal immigration or,
that's absolutely part of it.
So give me your thoughts on how that works in regard to declaring a planetary emergency, right? Because right now, I think if you did that, based on just the previous discussions, the right would largely push back, right? Because they're very resistant, and rightly so, to the UN, and unless it happens to be interest of the political paradigm. So how do you see that going? And talk about that planetary emergency point.
Sure. So that's a great point you make there. Like the just broadly speaking, the left has mostly bought the COVID operation. Not all of them, of course. There's leftists against lockdowns, things like that.
Let me say really quickly, the way I look at it is you've got the Democrats and Republicans, and that's the two-party illusion, team sport politics maniac. Then you've got liberals and conservatives
Mainstream
that are a
left
little
and
bit
right,
more open, and then you've got people that are away. I think that's the whole thing. Go
So
ahead.
some folks in there that would probably be more left than right
Mhm.
fell for and have continued to fall for the COVID operation and a lot of different things. And yes, are more likely to believe the United Nations and trust these sort of severity of the claims of man-made climate change and things like that, where the right is more, broadly speaking, again, more likely to question those things. But I do think, and this is just as one example, the fact that we're seeing Peter Thiel and around the Trump campaign, and of course all of his connections, and Zuckerberg, basically getting behind Trump, and Musk getting behind Trump. We're seeing big tech get behind Trump, and those are the technocrats, in our day and age. And the world that Elon wants to create, that we pointed out, is very similar to the fourth industrial revolution that Klaus Schwab calls to, including transhumanism and brain chips, but
the good version.
Yeah, the good version, all kinds of stuff like that, right? So that is, like you were saying, I think that's another way that many of the right will be, the Trump supporting right will be deceived into supporting some of these very same agendas, that, okay, maybe they're going to question the climate change aspect of it and the way that the narrative comes in that front, but that'll get some of those people who are maybe more left leaning. But then the folks on the right, and also through what you were just saying, maybe calls for, as Trump has said in the past, and as Whitney Webb has reported, like calling for not only digital identities, but facial recognition systems. And I've written about the digital border wall and stuff like that, to fight this illegal immigration that everybody knows has become a problem. And it could be this problem, reaction, solution situation, as we've seen before. But there'll be people who support that, or who at least make excuses for it because Trump's doing it, and because, well, we got to start immigration in some way. And, well, if we get digital IDs, it will make it, there won't be any more voter fraud, and we could trust elections finally. And, if we have facial recognition cameras everywhere, everybody, just, they'll sell it in different ways. That's the major point, is these people behind the scenes, really, what I often refer to as the predator class, will manipulate both all these different groups in whatever ways they believe they can.
Right. And it's always framed as that, like, and it could literally be digital ID, and they'll say, well, it's not like the end point where it's like just about to happen. You'll end up getting the kind of narrative that's like, well, at least Trump's the one doing it, because he'll make sure we're doing the right way.
Like 15-minute cities, Trump's talked about freedom cities.
Right, exactly.
I've seen that's literally a thing. He's talked about, we're going to build these beautiful freedom cities. And I could just imagine that becoming this 5G smart city, 15-minute city, whatever.
Or the Elon overlap you already pointed out, that suddenly it's the good AI, because it's, he's the one doing it. And so they just sleepwalk into it because they've convinced themselves that he wouldn't do that. It's very childlike mindset.
Well,
it's terrifying.
To tie it back into some of the future, one of the ways I think this is all going to tie back in, because again, the Great Reset, that agenda hasn't gone anywhere. People were very awake to it during COVID 1984, and making big moves, moving around the world, protesting in the millions. Like, there was some major resistance in some parts of the world to the measures that were taking place.
Pretty nonpartisan.
And people were like waking up to that June 2020 announcement of the World Economic Forum, the Great Reset, and in their conference in January 2021. That hasn't gone anywhere. That call it whatever name you want to call it now, it still is something they're working on in different ways. And this Summit of the Future is just another iteration of that. And I want to point out that besides digital identities, and we were talking about facial recognition and talking about these different aspects of getting this agenda, which again, they can sell to us as carbon credits. We already saw Jeffrey Sachs is advocating for a new international system of taxation on emissions and different things like that. They're going to be able to get this digital technocratic system that they want one another, whether it's through a push of climate change, pandemics or fighting immigration. And that involves having digital identities, having facial recognition everywhere, eventually things like social credit scores, but also digital currencies. And we know CBDCs. So I want to mention that just like many other places, we're seeing the call for the Summit of the Future to also create a new international financial system. They keep saying it's time for a new Bretton Woods movement, which is, of course, what created the International Monetary Fund. And there's a UN document that I quote from that's called "What Would It Deliver?" And it calls for a global financial system that works for all and a transformed international financial architecture fit for purpose, and includes all the words: inclusive, representative, effective, resilient, etc. But it's basically about creating a new financial system to fund the SDGs, to rapidly create them, finish them by 2020, to reach these goals, 2030, to reach these goals of completing these 17 sustainable development goals based around climate change. And this is, as I reported for TLAV back in 2023, when France held the Summit for a New Global Financing Pact. They've been kind of building to this moment of not just declaring the planetary emergency, which is the major part of it, but also remaking the UN 2.0, and some sort of new international financial agreement to get major funding, probably from groups like BlackRock and others, and not because it says not just nations anymore, that they want to move beyond just it being funded by donations from nations. We need all state. This is stakeholder capitalism, right?
Right.
So they start getting these private funding along with government funding, which is all taxed from people, to basically invest the money to rapidly get to these 2030 agenda and net zero goals. And that is, I think, another major worrisome aspect of this upcoming Summit of the Future and this Pact for the Future.
So in regard to the fund, like to the public-private partnership that you highlighted there, like, so what from your understanding of that, what does that change for them? Like, so, what is the concern there? Why would that be happening? Like, my first thought is the idea that there's now elements of things that are very clearly controlling or, in some way influencing the way you live your life. Yeah. But if you want to investigate or ask, well, sorry, it's a private company, So what are your thoughts on that? Other ways that might be used, and like why they would be why doesn't the government just come out and say, this is your best interest? Why is it becoming this weird fascist overlap?
Oh, with the corporate and kind of public. Yeah. Well, I think that
Whitney makes this point about like Palantir, and, like the point being that like lifelong total information awareness, just we push back and they go, okay, we'll use Palantir, we'll make it a private company then, so how to give me that version of what we're dealing with here today.
In some ways, it being, when it goes to private companies or private organizations, or even various versions of non-profit type philanthropic organizations, especially, for one, there's different privacy rules that the public can't necessarily FOIA some of those organizations, right? As you can a government agency, something like that. So that's one thing, is being able to move communications or maybe funds, because you can hide behind some of these different
it's private qualifications. It's a private company when you want it to be. It's the government when you want it to be, right?
Yeah,
so
exactly. Or some 501 whatever that has certain levels of privacy that the public can't get to. There's different things. There would be benefits to somebody if they wanted to use them in these ways. And yeah, I think that overall, this is that. I don't think it's cliche to say that it fits the definition of fascism when it does become this public-private collaboration. Not to say that every single thing where the government and some outside agency, organization, corporation, etc., collaborate on, like they build a park. Obviously, that would maybe, I guess that's still fascism or whatever, right? Well, but you know what I mean, like within reason. But when they're coming together to then, in this case, it's not only just that, like, let's give them a bunch of money so they can spread the Agenda 2030 propaganda and start initiating programs. And they're specifically saying that developing the third world nations need money to rapidly transform them. So they're going to try, whether they want it or not, right? Yeah, exactly. They're going to try to get them all, like we've seen them do in India with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation funding the Aadhaar system of digital identities and scanning the retina of billions of Indian people, like over 5 years to a decade. And obviously China and other places. So they want to go in these places. And I've written about this before too, that the whole thing is these poor people are, they don't have identity in there. They just don't have a bank account. We need to get them banked, and they're the debanked of the world, and they talk about it like it's a negative thing. We need to get them into the matrix. So we need to get them a digital identity, scan their thumb, their retina, get them in the biometric system, so then they can get government documents and then get a job or something. That's the way they paint it, right? But it's really, they're creating this apparatus, and it's easier to sell in the unfortunately, in the developing world, many places, who are in poverty and who could use some support, they are able to kind of buy that in by sort of, in some ways, maybe actually elevating their life standard, but also, of course, doing it in a way that is bringing them into the system already, that in some places like the US and elsewhere, we're trying to prevent going into, you know.
Well, then they present it like some kind of panacea that's going to solve all their problems, when obviously that's plenty more problems come along with it, even if you do have some benefit from it, you know. What I wanted to ask about the CBDC point, right? And so the idea of the CBDCs is a really very prominent aspect of all of this. And so what do you think about the idea? Like, so we have a conversation about AI and the worry that whether or not they do reach some level of, you know, whether we're talking about sentience or anything, you know, the idea that the AI is the something knows better, right? Listen to it, you know, whether that's the reality or they're just behind the scenes pumping in where they want, you know, the AI says, you know, like kind of thing, where it's really just the social engineers kind of using that as like a puppet almost. In your mindset, you're worried that that's something that might similar happen in regard to CBDCs, right? Where, you know, it's not what they frame it as, it's just simply some level of digital currency that's just being used. Like one of the popular statements somebody made, I forget who it was like, look, why do we need this? We already have Venmo and digital, you know, obviously, because it's just this ability to control, you know. So where do you see that at right now? And then give me your thoughts on, you know, where that's at and where it's going in regard to CBDCs.
Well, so this is an interesting conversation because, as you mentioned earlier, we're going to the Bitcoin conference out here this weekend, and you know, not to get the whole conversation in that direction, but I've been involved with the Bitcoin space since 2012 in terms of receiving my first transaction for just some journalism I was doing back then, and then starting to report at the Texas Bitcoin conference in 2013, 2014, interviewing Ben Swan and Vitalik of Ethereum and other, you know, just learning about the space and exploring it, and have seen it go from, at that point, being a very anarchistic, free-minded, you know, freedom-minded, etc. Space of, you know, mostly what people would term back in the 90s, the cypherpunk type people, like, this is non-government money. This could potentially get us away. You know, a lot of people from the End the Fed movement who are like, this could get us off the central banking system. And
I still think that.
I believe that as well. And there was always that, and that was the majority back then. And then the folks who even then, I'd say 2013, 14, who were like, if we're going to really grow this, it needs to become regulated. We need government support to make it mainstream, acceptance, et cetera. Well, that side has mostly won these days, you know, and, you know, that's like, again, a whole other conversation. But in terms of the CBDC, I do think that Mark Godwin, who Whitney's been doing some pieces with recently, formerly over at the Bitcoin magazine, that he is correct. He called it the Bitcoin dollar, that just like we have the petrodollar, that Bitcoin, along with a CBDC, I think, is going to be out. They are going to be kind of allowed to continue, but it is going to go all digital. But just like you already have a dollar and then you can get gold, Bitcoin has been promoted by a lot of these people, not as a currency that we can use that will get us away from the government and away from taxes and away from the Federal Reserve System, which was the way that I was originally learned about, what I was excited about, you know, why I still use things like Monero and things like that. But over the years, the folks who, and it's some of them connected to Blockstream, connected to the Bilderberg Group, connected to shady people, have called for it not being a currency. It's digital gold. Hold it. Now, you know, it's mainstream pretty much. You got big corporations, BlackRock and others saying that it's a great thing. And so Mark and others have argued, I think correctly, that we're going to see this system where, yes, there will be some type of CBDC rolled out in different countries. And that we're already seeing these programs tested and seeing it tested by the Bank of International Settlements. And but then Bitcoin will still be allowed, but it's not going to be some freedom money. It's this just, okay, at best, some investment that those who continue it might get some gains on, but not in a radical way that you actually use it. Like, it's just going to be another thing you hold, effectively defeating the original purpose and intention of it. So I think that's kind of what, in terms of the financial thing, and now that's why they're calling for this new financial international system, but also calling for a major investment of cash, like injection of cash into the UN's efforts to, you know, in the next 5 years or so, 5.5 years, to complete these goals. And so that's the other reason that I think it's potentially worrisome. In addition to just that, like I said, that call for the planetary emergency, the emergency platform is what they call it. And as I write here, and I've pointed out in a few articles now, that this goes back to the Club of Rome, and like they've been around since the 60s. And they have been calling for a planetary emergency since at least 2019, and a document that they called the Planetary Emergency Plan, which they released right prior to COVID and then updated like in August 2020 to include discussion of pandemics. And but it basically says it's a roadmap for governments and other stakeholders to shift our societies and our economies to bring balance between people, planet, and prosperity. And so, yeah, it's them. And you can go back and follow their history of their being essentially calling for population control in some way, eugenics, and same thing. They've been calling for this planetary emergency. It's these like Paul Ehrlich and these other scientists who've been wrong and declaring there's gonna be a population bomb and humanity is the problem. Like these are the psychopaths and in many cases who have influenced. Just like we talked about earlier, not everybody at the UN is a bad person. There are good people who do go in there with positive intentions, and maybe even in their little arena of things, they do some good, you know. But overall, the institution and the people who are driving it and things like this, the Pact for the Future, the Declaration of a Planetary Emergency, are coming from the Club of Rome, who wrote back in the 90s that the real enemy is humanity itself, and said that, you know, basically that we're causing all these problems. They realized that that was the way they could achieve their goals after the eugenicist movement became unpopular, obviously post World War II. Of course, we know that Hitler's ideas came from the American eugenicists. Like it's an idea that many people have forgotten about, but I do think that's what this really comes back to. And that doesn't mean, again, what's going to happen in September is necessarily going to lead to population control the next day, but this is one of the many steps, and there are more to come, in this direction of pushing us ultimately towards a world government that can, from the top down, technocratic, centralized position, and using things like AI in the negative way, because it's just a tool and it could be used in some positive ways, and it already is in some ways. But using that along with what we described earlier, digital identities, facial recognition, basically creating a system that can be tracked and traced and easily managed, that is the technocratic vision. And then they talked about back in the day too, the original technocrats, energy credits. Well, we talk about carbon credits. We talk about these sorts of things. Like that's the system that they're building. And unfortunately, I think that this Summit of the Future, this Pact for the Future, this Declaration of Planetary Emergency, in addition to now they're saying they're going to sign the Declaration on Future Generations, the Global Digital Compact. I haven't looked into each of those deeply yet, but those are, I think, other things to pay attention to. So it's my goal with writing about this in this particular article, saying like, hey, why does this matter, is because just like I mentioned with the pandemic agreement thing, I think it deserves that much attention. I don't know what that looks like. I wish that sometimes there was still some protest spirit out there. I know that life is hard and a lot of people are struggling for money and can't just fly to New York, but it would be amazing if there was some organization out there. Like we're organizing another Greater Reset. Now we're calling it the People's Reset event the week after, is our form of protest or pushing back. That's the People's Reset UK happening in Bath, UK. And so that's going to be similar, 3 days like they're doing, but of solutions from bottom up ideas as we've done over the years. So I'm trying to do my part and then writing about it, but ultimately it's just about getting this awareness out there because like we said earlier, most people don't even know these things are going on. And I get it. Like people are overworked. They're tired. They're trying to just make it through
by design.
Things. And that exactly is by design. So you don't have time to stop and think and be able to even think about getting out of these systems. But if you're hearing this broadcast, you found yourself here one way or the other, then this is the heads up to you that they're working on these things. And this is more reason to not be dependent on their systems, because the world that they're trying to describe here, they're trying to work towards in the name of fighting these planetary crises, fighting climate change, etc., is not one that's going to lead to privacy and liberty and freedom for yourself or your family or anybody else.
Yeah, I agree, man. And I think that, as we kind of highlighted before, the central problem is that it always comes back to some kind of reverence for authority. And this point of people within the UN, you said, or any other situation. One of the reasons why we shouldn't be boxing out any potential ally, consider that their intentions may be bad, but that there are people that believe that they can work through that system. And the point is, you come to an end. I don't see how you can do that without thinking at some level like the system is inherently good. And I think that that's been shown not to be the case. But, there are people within it that think that they can achieve something positive through it. I disagree. But I think there are people out there that we can reach with this message, that might change their opinion on that. And just one last, you pointed out the idea of like the CBDC overlap, the same thing we said with Palantir. The point is that this is now going in a direction that is becoming privatized. Right. So as Whitney points out, that Trump's famously against CBDCs, but he's now working over, potentially overlapping with Jamie Dimon, Larry Fink, and they're all working on things right now that are going in that exact direction, and so it's a very easy shell game with the partisan views.
No, but Trump said he didn't say that. That was just, the radical left must have spread that rumor. He didn't say that, he claims.
Right. We'll see what actually happens.
Even though he's quoted in Bloomberg saying that.
Right. Well, as we were joking about before, you've got these weird overlaps, like where, actually, no, it might have been a different show I said this, but the point being that like Elon Musk came out and said, or it was reported that he was going to give $45 million a month, I think, to Trump's campaign. And then he was just recently asked about it. And he said, no, that's not true. It's fake news. Yeah. Trump recently publicly said it in an open discussion where he said, hey, we got the money from Elon. It's just like, so maybe Trump's reading the news too. And it's just funny that
some fake news out there.
Yeah, right. It's always manipulated.
And I want to mention just one other brief note on this Summer of the Future, because this is probably going to be something that I'll explore more in the future, or just in case anyone out there sees this name or you see this name popping up. I mentioned this, I just called it the Stemon Center connection, because as I've been researching the Summit of the Future, I keep seeing this name popping up as one of the organization that's hosting like online forums, webinars, etc., discussing it. And so I did just a little look into their background, because once again, they just last week held an online an in-person meeting, but also was streamed online, discussing the Summit of the Future, and particularly mentioning the U.S. position. And there was some interesting things said there, but basically just supporting, saying, hey, the U.S. is fully behind signing the Pact for the Future and the Planetary Emergency. Like, so that's the U.S. is definitely advocating for this. That's another thing. So it's not just something I'm warning about that nobody's paying attention to. The U.S. is pretty much ready to go on board, and they're expecting all 193, whatever, 92 member nations to sign it. But the Stemon Center they'd call themselves a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization focused on international peace, nuclear proliferation, water management, et cetera. So all the climate crisis, et cetera, all those sort of things. And they're just one of these think tanks that puts out white papers. They hold these meetings in person and online. But it's named after an interesting guy, Henry L. Stemon. He was this lawyer, politician. He served as Secretary of War under FDR. Secretary of War under Taft, Secretary of State under Hoover. And according to the National Park Service, he had direct control of the Manhattan Project, which was, of course, the U.S. Nuclear weapons project. And so anyways, they have relationships through grant funding from the Rockefeller Foundation, from the Gates Foundation. Not, like, I would say they're working hand in hand every year, but the Gates Foundation has given them almost $1 million. The Rockefeller Foundation giving them hundreds of thousands of dollars for the last few years since 2020. So there's that connection, and that makes sense. That matters because we know both those organizations are involved in promoting various climate change narratives. The Gates Foundation funding geoengineering and things like that. So it is this Stemon Center they're doing like op-ed pieces, virtual conferences. As I said, they just recently held this U.S. perspectives and priorities for the UN Summit of the Future. And they had their one of their ambassadors there speaking, and she, as I mentioned, just supporting the Planetary Emergency Declaration, supporting calls for creating an emergency platform, and that's, I think, something else to pay attention to. But yeah, that name Stemon Center, I think we're going to see them more and more. I'm just continuing to dig into who's involved in that organization, but just in general, it's just another one of these bodies that we should, if you see them associated with certain things, you probably can start to garner the kind of issues they're going to be promoting, and the propaganda or otherwise.
I mean, it's just so many of these, but just these think tanks and groups and agencies we don't even know exist. But before we end up, one thing I wanted to ask you is just about the platform. What does that mean exactly? Right. And so, like, because it's the word itself seems almost deliberately confusing with what, like, are they talking about like an online concept? Or so explain what that means for people in regard to, based on whatever they claim is the planetary polycrisis emergency, what would they then create? And on the way out here, what would that achieve?
Yeah. So it says the zero draft version of the Pact for the Future. Like I said, they released that in March or so. So this is just early version. I think they've only released one more since this, but it talks about the emergency platform that would be activated, and this is the exact wording I was discussing earlier, in the event of, quote, such a shock that has an impact on multiple regions of the world and would require a, quote, coherent, coordinated, and multidimensional response. Now, they claim that...
And that's the platform. That's the response they're saying? So what do they mean by platform?
So right here, it says the emergency platform, quote, would not be a standing institution or body. This is what they claim. And that the UN claims the, quote, decision to convene an emergency platform that would, in their words, fully respect the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of states.
We swear.
So it's interesting they put that in there. Like, they make it clear like that, which feels like a little bit of like, we got to put that in there.
Yeah.
So yeah, so that's part of it. Now I go into explaining how there's other organizations funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, like the Climate Governance Commission, who've been promoting this idea, of course, the Club of Rome. But in another area, they do get further into defining what they mean by emergency platform. So they talk about a planetary emergency platform to address rapidly accelerating consequences of climate change. And again, this planetary emergency goes back to the Club of Rome's planetary emergency plan. So it's kind of like, I guess, like the name they're giving. It's weird because, yeah, I guess you could say it's the response, because they're claiming it's not going to be a standing institution or a body. So not like a new organization per se or an office or anything. It's just an idea. It's a response. So,
and this is kind of what I'm getting at.
It's vague. You know?
Well, okay. So what they're describing is governmental action across multiple nations, right? Yeah. So just because they're like, we swear it's not, sovereignty, or like, it's almost like what they're outlining is a multinational governmental act, agenda, or, a body is what it is. Right. And then it would be like, but it's not a government. Like you can't hold us accountable, to me, it seems like this wildly unaccountable thing that they're doing, that basically the way they frame it makes it seem like, so what do? You petition your own government about something that's happening globally. You go to the UN. Like, it seems intentionally obtuse or, undefined for that very reason. Like, that's the first way I read that.
That is, well, this is one of the major problems, in my view, of the idea of world government. Well, for one, I wish that we were in a world where the idea that we could bring all nations together and have some like peaceful things and take humanity to, as far as we can go. And I wish that was our world, and I hope and that we'll get there. But for the moment, you're not going to throw China, Russia, the United States, et cetera, into some like giant blender of world government and get out a peaceful, like, representative democracy where we can trust that the UN based in New York City or Switzerland or somewhere else, like where these bodies are typically based, are then going to care about the needs of every single nation and understand it. No, the idea is to use, at least in the technocratic vision, to micromanage the resources available to each area and, of course, digitize it in many ways. So it's problematic for multiple reasons. Ultimately, we got to get people to start realizing that the UN is not something we can trust. A lot of people have woken up to the World Economic Forum. Right. The UN is tied to that, and it's not some right-wing position to question that. And I am glad that like there are some people, like, I don't know whether to fully trust her or not, and this is one of the reasons I want to interview her. Vandana Shiva. She says a lot of great things, though, in terms of speaking out against this. Bill Gates and geoengineering and Monsanto, of course, and things like that. Now, there are some older reports you can find that say that she was a member of the Club of Rome. Now, that doesn't rule her out automatically as somebody who's doing good work, but I would like to ask her, like, is that a membership that still exists? Could you talk to us about that?
Is that why you realized there's a problem?
Yeah, maybe exactly. Yeah. Maybe she's not anymore and she had a different experience. But so, we just need to realize that there are ways to help our world and to improve the world, specifically the environment and all the different things that we're dealing with, that don't have to involve giving up our individual liberty, and to recognize, for one, that is what's on the plate. Like, they're not going to come out and explicitly say that, but what they're talking about starts to create more power for this international totally unelected body to take steps that will influence our lives, and that, whether that's what's on your plate or, again, how often you can travel, where you can drive, etc. And in the form of new taxation systems. I think that the further away government is, the less responsive it's going to be. If you think you have trouble right now getting representation at Washington, D.C. or wherever your capital is, then imagine that when it's just, even more thousands of miles away.
Ask any European country right now how that's working with the EU.
With the EU, people don't like feeling like that. So imagine that on even more of a global scale, national scale. And, that's, I think, what this is really working towards. This is why they're using the climate crisis, and they will use any other crisis, cyber panic, cyber attack, whatever. It is to try to grab more of that power. And this is why these types of things, this discussion of an emergency platform, whether it's a standing institution or just some declaration and waiting to be ready to pull out as soon as they describe as their thing, just hits multiple regions of the world. That's pretty broad.
And then the next thing you know, we're in a forever emergency, which is already kind of what's going on.
But on the global scale, like a worldwide scale, like the U.S. has been an emergency since 9/11, and even before that, but
even the
definitely
opioid
since
crisis is still
9/11.
an ongoing emergency state.
And so because of that, as many people might not be aware, that does, in those cases, the government says, well, it's an emergency, so we can do extra things that we don't get to do in peacetime or
Suspend the
non-emergency times.
Constitution.
Exactly. Go around the Constitution. So imagine that if it's a planetary emergency, worldwide emergency, and they're like, well, because of that, we get to do X, Y, and Z that we wouldn't be able to do in normal peacetime, and that we promise we'll get back to one day in the future.
Right. Yeah. And the last thing I'll leave it on that is that, we're talking about the idea of individuals and individual sovereignty, or, as a nation, but, your own individual rights being circumvented. You think about this on a global scale, what's the first thing you're going to see is that, well, this is a global body, except for that person, that country, and these groups, because they're terrorists, or they don't agree. They think this, that's what will always happen, is they essentially create what they call the international community, which is really the ones that are in line with their agenda, and the rest get boxed out. And so right out of the gate, I promise you, as you highlight China or Russia, it's like, wait, so are they the biggest threat to our democracy, but we're going to work to save the planet? Like, how does that work? There's so much overlap and dishonesty in all this. That's why your work is so important here, is that really beginning to open this door for people. And I know there was a bunch of other things we were going to get into on the way out. Did you want to shout anything out before we wrap for today?
I would just, well, thanks for, first let's, for the conversation. We're having this in person again. And I hope everybody's enjoyed it. And I hope you will check out the Summit of the Future and learn more about it, spread the words, whether that's printing out flyers, that's sharing my articles, sharing this interview and this discussion and my other previous discussions with Ryan on this. Whatever you can do, I think it does matter. I think it does have an impact. And just like we saw with the awareness around the pandemic agreement, I think that's definitely, and it's not to say, of course, that that's disappeared by any means at all, but it seems like it was delayed in the big moment that people were building to. And I would say that's got to, the public pressure has had to play a role to some degree, because the world in different countries, different languages, and pushing as far as Japan and other places, protests and push back in different ways. So I think that's a great thing to see. And if we could get something similar, some type of other similar awareness with the Summit of the Future, that would be a really great thing. And I'm grateful to see that some of my articles I've written about it have been translated to Spanish and some other things like that. So getting the word out, I think, on that does matter. I did want to mention that I put out another article in my, probably for now, there might be a part 4 in the future, but probably for now, it's going to be the last one in this Bethany Christian Services series, which I did about the adoption firm, Bethany Christian Services. And in the first 2, it was more specifically about the organization, exploring their history and their funding and how they're kind of related to this broader movement that I wasn't even really aware of it, but essentially very wealthy Christian evangelical philanthropists who are funding adoption firms and at the same time, funding anti-abortion legislation and funding adoption firms and trying to put their, investments, their money towards that, and the consequences of that, and how it's not all lovely and beautiful like most people would like to believe, that the case of mother can't have baby, so they choose to adopt, and they find a baby that came from a home that was unhappy, or parents died or something, and then they get a better life, and everything's good. That appears to be the minority of the cases, from what I've learned, unfortunately. Yeah. And so this is we looked at the history of Bethany Christian Services in the first one. In the second series, I talked to 4 different families, 3 who went on the record about their direct experience with Bethany Christian Services. And we found court records and court documents from California and elsewhere documenting the cases of what they're talking about, of manipulation, lying to parents about these so-called open adoptions, just all sorts of things. And so that was the second piece, and that's really important. To me, it felt good because this is directly us sharing the stories of these women. And this is not something that most people have, or I wasn't aware of this before. I was made aware of these information from a listener who sent me this way and told me about their story. And it's a whole different area of research, that you could kind of broadly term adoption truth. And so for this third article, I wanted to show a couple of the organizations that have been formed that are actually trying to do the good work of helping people out, which I think is an important story to highlight the solutions. But also, of course, they are people who have suffered from the adoption industry themselves, and that's why they chose to get involved and help other people. And then also I look at the international adoption scene, specifically the Korean adoption industry. And that is a whole nother story that I just started to touch into. And so if I do a part 4 in the future, it's going to be focused on more of the international Korean, Ukraine. There's Africa, other international adoption scene. But this one was important because the group Saving Our Sisters and the Adoption Truth, they have let me see if I remember. I want to say it right. The Adoption, Truth, and Transparency Network, Information Worldwide Network. They do Adoption, Truth, and Transparency Worldwide Information Network. They both do great work, and one is Janine Vance and then Renee Gellin and her partner there. They're providing resources and information for parents who, for whatever reason, may be considering adoption as an option, and not to push them to any other adoption necessarily, other than trying to keep families together. That's their main kind of thing. And because, as I reported in the previous pieces, Bethany Christian Services has partnerships with these hospitals. So if a mother expresses some doubt about wanting to have a baby, whether it's like, I think I want to have an adoption, or I'm thinking of abortion or whatever, Bethany's right there to say, here, learn about our organizations, and then immediately starts to become kind of coercive and like pushing them, saying, hey, we've got family ready. The family starts showing up and just different things. And often to not always the case, but often to very young women who are low income, no support network, maybe have drug issues or mental health issues, people who are being manipulated in some cases. And as I show in this, and through the stories that we've learned here, particularly in Korea, that this is essentially legalized child trafficking in many cases. And I say legalized because they technically have, through their system they've created, have the backing of the government, the local governments, whether it's in Korea or the United States or elsewhere.
And it's like a post-World War II network kind of
that
setup
one particularly,
thing, right?
Exactly. And so that's one of the women I recently interviewed is journalist Catherine Joyce, and she's the author of Child Catchers, and I quote her in this piece where she's talking about that, and it was called the baby scoop era, post World War II. And in the Korean situation, it was post Korean War. Lots of these Korean orphans that were there, and then these different, mostly Christian evangelical organizations stepped in, and this infrastructure and this sort of model was created largely in Korea and then exported out to other places of, just commodifying and these babies. And so now it's a $1 billion industry, like, billions of dollars a year is made through adoption, and in some cases outright lying to parents, like both the parents of let's say the parents that are around, but maybe they're not rich by U.S. standards, but they still have a house and their parents, they're there's love, all that stuff. And in some cases, Bethany and other organizations, there's also the Holt adoption firm that I've learned more about, that will go there and just outright lie to parents, say that they're going to the U.S. for some sort of like schooling, but then essentially take them and then sell them to another family that's adopting them and was told that their parents were killed or something like that. And then later in life, the child starts to research and then these things are happening, and it's not uncommon at all based on what I've found. And so,
and the lie of open adoption. And that's one of the hardest parts of this, is these parents being promised they were reluctant, but they give in because it might be better for them. At least I get to see them. And then that doesn't turn out to be the case.
They often think that, as I reported as well, and as Catherine Joyce told me too, that sometimes it's women who are just as short of like a $500 bill or something, where, they're going through a tough time financially, economically, which, can happen even after you have a child, but you make ends meet, you make things work, right? But in that tough space, like you said, they might reluctantly choose to go through adoption, and mainly with the impression that they will be getting letters and they'll be getting updates and they'll be able to be in their child's life. And then that door being closed really quickly, either by the adoption, the adoptive family, or Bethany themselves, after making all these promises. So it's really heartbreaking situations here. And so just to wrap this up, the final thing I'll mention is the Korean situation is massive. I mean, it's now making mainstream news, thankfully, in Australia, because there are South Korean babies were sent to Australia, of course, the Western world, the UK, Canada, the US, Australia. They were sent many other places post World War II, and many of them thought that their families were killed, and some were legitimately orphans, but many of them did have families and parents. And the interesting case is that Janine Vance, who's one of the Vance twins, her and her sister were in this situation when they went back to Korea for this anniversary for Korean adoptees. She said that she saw father like in the street looking for answers, trying to search for his daughter, who he, had no idea where she was at, and she'd been adopted out. And this kind of led her on a journey of investigating this whole thing. So it's just this really big thing that, in some ways, thankfully, there seems to be getting traction. Like they're working with dozens of organizations to send this special request for the Korean government to investigate this. They have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to investigate Korean atrocities throughout history, particularly the war.
And pushed up the network, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so, there is some awareness building but for the most part, when I talk to Janine and talk to some of these other women, the mothers and Renee, it's that there's just a huge lack of education, that most people have a completely different idea of what they think is going on in the adoption industry. But unfortunately, much like we've learned with things like CPS, foster care, one of my next big investigations is sort of tangentially related, and that's looking at some folks that might have heard about them recently through some documentaries that came out, these WASP systems, these student program systems that through Dr. Phil and other shows like that, where they take these kids, like literally strip them away and take them to these crazy schools with abuse going on. There's just so many different systems like that people think are one thing. In reality, child rehabilitation for tough kids or stuff like that, or great adoption agencies or foster care for people who need to be their child protective services when parents are are abusive and stuff. But unfortunately, these systems are manipulated, corrupted.
Right for abuse.
They're imperfect, of course. I'm not saying there's no good people in there, but it's definitely more going on. And so my goal with this whole series has been to just highlight it, because I was not aware of this until, again, a reader reached out to me. So thanks again, of course, to everybody who always sends ideas and tips and things like that, because sometimes we don't see stories that are going on, and there's just so much going on, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, it's an important series, and I hope you guys will take the time to check it out. Because there's so many major things going on in the world. It's something like this that tends to fall on radar, but it's these, like you said, about CPS or other things that we've talked about for a very long time, the both of us. That they're. I mean, you going back a long ways, and even you have not even that long ago had a great investigation about like the finders, and this overlaps obviously like sexual trafficking, which is a different topic, but they overlap, right? And here we're talking about
for sure,
like that. The point is, and right now you're getting into that aspect of it, but I would imagine if you dig in these elements that you will find the connection, and it will, because they are rife. They're rife with abuse, or but the potential for it, because I think it was even the CPS that acknowledged over the years. I think it was California, but that there was I forget the exact number, but I remember it was something like 60 like a huge percentage of the people that found themselves in these sexual networks were coming through CPS and foster care. And that doesn't have to mean that was deliberately done. We should ask that question, but just the overlap. The willful ignorance to the idea that, well, this is an inherently good thing, so we shouldn't question it, gets abused by the predators that we know are there.
That's that blind trust in authority.
Exactly. So I really appreciate your work, man, and it's great to have you in the studio and have this conversation. Absolutely, hopefully, we can do it more in the future, and we'll have a lot more to talk about, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on, and appreciate that. I hope everybody will check out the Summit of the Future, and then again learn more about Bethany Christian Services and that whole, what I'm calling the adoption industry complex.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for everyone for tuning in, and as always, question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.